Okay, Jan, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, hello and welcome to this morning's webinar session, and it's a briefing on the Assisted Dying Bill, which is part of the 2022 NPC Annual Conventional sessions. At the request of many of our NPC members, we have invited Dignity in Dying campaigners, Dr. Jackie Davis and Tom Davies, who will give a briefing on the aims of the Assisted Dying Bill, proposed by Dignity in Dying Chair Baroness Meacher. But first, though, I'd like to introduce Jonathan Safier, our National Administration and Information Manager, to explain the format for today. Okay, Jonathan.
Hi, everyone. Just a quick update on what, there's not really much that you need to know in terms of housekeeping. You'll see that the live transcript is on for anyone with hearing impairments and so on. And any questions that you might have, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And we will endeavour to get them answered either in this session, or we'll take a note of all the questions that come in and we'll try and get all the questions answered afterwards. We will be hearing from our speakers, but first we'll be hearing from Jan, who will give a brief introduction.
All right, thanks, Jonathan. So if anybody's got any issues, please put your query into the chat and we'll try and help you out. We understand that gremlins like parties, so sometimes things go wrong. Right, now, assisted dying is an important, highly emotive issue, and the NPC fully recognises that people hold powerful and differing moral and practical arguments, both for and against it. Now, I must make clear that the NPC holds no position one way or another. We believe it is a highly personal matter and that our members must draw their own conclusions and make their own choices. So we're holding this session purely to provide our members with more information. I will be posing questions from our members to today's speakers, Dr. Jackie Davis and Tom Davies, and they are going to do a two-part presentation. So I will call on Dr. Jackie Davis first to start this morning's briefing. Okay, Jackie, thank you.
Thank you. Have we got the slides somewhere? Thanks. And can I move them on? No, I can't. I'll have to ask somebody to. Okay. Firstly, thanks to Jan for inviting us to speak today on this, as she said, very, very difficult and emotive subject. We're from Dignity in Dying, which campaigns for an assisted dying law in this country. And I chair the medical subgroup of that, Healthcare Professionals for Assisted Dying. And if there's anybody out there who is or has been a healthcare professional and who supports our aims, please do join us. It's free. We can tell you how to sign up if you're interested. And then Tom will follow. He knows about the politics of this. Okay, next one, thanks. What's going on at the moment in this country? Well, we have no assisted dying law. It is illegal to help somebody have an assisted death. Even if you go with somebody to Dignitas, you may find the police on your doorstep when you come back. And that's a very traumatic prospect for most people. So we have no assisted dying law in this country. Next slide, please. Why do we need an assisted dying law in this country? You know, every day people die bad deaths in this country. I'm sure everybody listening to this will know somebody who has died a bad death. And I have two in my immediate family. I don't think I'm unusual. And one bad death is bad, but many bad deaths every day. And the figures have been done. Probably 17 people every day die in this country without their symptoms being adequately controlled. So that's not nice, it's not fair, it's traumatic for the patients involved, it's traumatic for their families, and we know from the rest of the world that we can do something about this. There is overwhelming support amongst the British public for this, over 84%, and we'll come back to that later. And without this choice, some terminally ill people, particularly cancer sufferers, are often involved, are afraid of what faces them and may take matters into their own hand. Next slide, thank you. What happens if we don't have an assisted dying law? Well, I've already said that people die bad deaths, and that's real, and that's without considering palliative care. Palliative care is good in this country. Even if we had the best palliative care available to everybody in the country, there would still be that number of people whose suffering could not be controlled at the end. And it's not just about physical pain, it's about loss of dignity and autonomy. We know that that's what worries people when they're facing the end of life. So some people will take matters into their own hand, as I've said, and they'll go to Dignitas. Now, in order to go to Dignitas in Switzerland, you need £10,000, which not everybody has. I say that most people don't have that to spare. You need to travel before you want to, because you need to be able to get there. So people will go and die there before they're ready to, because of the challenge of traveling. And they have to have family or friends who are prepared to support them in that, and who may come back and find that they're of interest to the police. And that has certainly happened recently. It's been in the newspapers. And terminally ill people don't want to think of putting their loved ones and their family in the way of that risk. They may take matters into their own hands in this country and take their own lives. And that's so tragic and sad. I've had it in my own family. Somebody, my brother, terminally ill with cancer, took his own life on his own. He didn't want the family involved. That's a terrible end for that person. And it's a terrible end for their loved ones to think of what happened. So we've got a very unsatisfactory situation in this country at the moment. Next slide, thank you. What would it mean for us? Well, I'll take you to the point at the bottom here. It would mean choice and compassion for dying people. Everybody would know, as they do in countries who have the law, that if it came to the point where their suffering was intolerable, they could turn to an assisted death. Now, the vast majority of people don't do it. I was talking to somebody from Oregon, where they've had a law for 25 years. The majority of people who actually end up with a medication in their house don't take it because they don't need it. But everybody has that reassurance that it's there. And it would show compassion not only to the terminally ill, but to their families who don't want to see their loved ones suffer. There would be better end-of-life discussions with healthcare professionals, because you can't discuss this at the moment. There'd be proper protection for doctors who want to participate in that, and those who are conscientious objectors, who of course would be allowed not to participate. And there'd be better protection for potentially vulnerable people, and this is a big issue, the vulnerable, and we can come back and look at that in more detail later if people want to. Next slide, thank you. What's going on internationally? I think people are really surprised to hear that over 200 million people around the world have access to assisted dying. And as I said, Oregon, who are the first people to go down this route, have had a law in place for 25 years. Everybody likes it. I was talking to somebody from Oregon last week. They've never changed it. They've never repealed it. It works. End of story. No, and you'll see a point on the slide here. No assisted dying laws have been repealed because people are satisfied with them. And this is getting closer to home. If we look at the next slide, we can see what's actually going on in specific countries. Thank you. So in the USA, it's legal in 10 states, but that is assisted death is available to 1 in 5 Americans, because California adopted assisted dying, and they're a huge state. So 1 in 5 Americans now have access to an assisted death. Australia has laws now. New Zealand voted in favor of it. Canada has had a law in place for quite some time now, and it's present on the continent. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, you may hear a lot about in the debate on assisted dying, because they, from the very beginning, had a much more broad law than we are proposing, which is based on the Oregon law, and Tom will go into the details about that a little bit. They allow euthanasia, they allow advanced life decisions so that demented people can say, I want this, but that would not apply with the law that we are supporting in this country. More recently, Spain and Austria have got laws, and positive discussions are going on at the moment in Southern Ireland, in Portugal, and Italy. So this is not some bizarre issue that is happening far away in small places. This is happening around the world, and that's why we have to look at it too. Thank you. Next slide. What's happening in the UK is very important. As I've said, point two here, overwhelming public support for this. And people understand what it means. Don't buy into the argument, oh, people support this because they don't understand it. They do understand it. The really important thing that's happened is there's been a change in the views of healthcare professionals. What happened, we'll come on to what happened at the BMA a little bit, but politicians, if you ever went and listened to them in the House of Lords, always said, we can't have this, doctors are opposed to it. Well, guess what? They're not. We've actually asked them the questions, and I'll cite the figures on the next slide. So healthcare professionals are now neutral or supportive, the majority of them. The House of Lords is on side with it. MPs have always been the problem. And as the slide says, we need a process for opening the debate in Westminster, but it's going on around us at the moment, close to home. Scotland is looking at a law at the moment. Jersey has voted to have a law, and the Isle of Man is looking at a law too. Now, those places, apart from Scotland, they seem perhaps small and who cares? But once you've got it on the doorstep in the United Kingdom, you really can't ignore it anymore. Thank you. Next one. It was very important that we got the BMA to drop its opposition to the assisted dying last year. We managed to get a membership survey, and it showed, guess what, that the majority of doctors actually supported legislation. A significant percentage were opposed to it, and so in order to reflect that spectrum, the BMA has adopted a neutral stance. That allows it to participate in any discussions that are coming up about any laws and get the best. Get the best for members, I'm on the BMA Council, and importantly, get the best for patients out of any law that we have. Before, they wouldn't even discuss it because they were opposed to it, and that was crazy. The Royal College of Nursing has been neutral since 2009. The Royal Colleges, who are the important professional bodies, have started surveying their members. The Royal College of Physicians surveyed it and changed their position to neutral. The egregious example here is the Royal College of GPs, who surveyed their members, heard that their members wanted to drop the opposition and didn't anyway. And this shows what happens when you've got very vocal opponents in highly placed in organisations. So the College of GPs is a little bit outside the norm at the moment. Next one, thank you. And as I've said, public support for this is huge. It's been at least over 70% for 3 decades, and the latest opinion poll showed 84%. And what's interesting about this is it cuts across all the usual divides. It cuts across politics, it cuts across religion. 80% of people of faith support assisted dying. And surprise, surprise, 86% of people with mental health conditions and disability actually support this, because you will hear a lot of opposition from organised religion and from organised disability groups, but those people do not represent, interesting, their grassroots members. Next slide, thank you. Okay, so Tom is going to talk now about the actual mechanics of the bill. So just in summary, what I want to say is that the law in this country doesn't work. We have bad deaths in this country every day, which are avoidable. There is a law abroad, the Oregon model, which has worked for 25 years, which has huge public support in this country, and there's absolutely no reason why we can't have it too. And we're determined to, and that's why we're fighting for it. And I hope we will get it soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jackie. So we're going to talk about the assisted dying bill and the political situation here in the UK. So to start off with the bill itself, this was the content of Baroness Meach's bill, which was introduced to the House of Lords last year, and very similar to Lord Falconer's bill, which was introduced to the House of Lords in 2014. It's based on the Oregon example that Jackie mentioned earlier, which has been unchanged for 25 years and is now the model for 10 states across the US, and very closely followed by both Australia and New Zealand. In short, it requires that someone must be over 18, must have a terminal illness, and must have mental capacity. They would have to make a written request and make 2 verbal requests with doctors individually and independent of one another. The doctors would be required to assess that person's capacity, their prognosis, and confirm they had a settled intention to die. Between all of these interviews with doctors or appointments with doctors, there would be a period of reflection for someone to have essentially a cooling off period, if you like, to have a think about their request, simply because we don't want this to be a very snap decision. We want this to be a considered decision, and we want it to be a long conversation between doctors and patients to ensure that we have the very best conversations, the very best outcomes for people who may not actually want an assisted death, but want to talk about their own end-of-life care. The Meacher Bill and the Faulkner Bill both suggest that there should also be an oversight of a High Court judge, as there currently is in other cases around things like withdrawal of treatment in some circumstances. And finally, the laws have suggested that the medication should be self-administered. It should be a person taking their own life, not as in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, where a doctor takes the life directly of their patient. Politically speaking, as Jackie mentioned earlier, the Lords are supportive. We've seen supportive votes in the House of Lords, and in October last year, the House of Lords progressed Baroness Meacher's bill. Unfortunately, that hasn't progressed beyond that because of stalling tactics from opponents who have laid down hundreds of amendments to try and prevent the bill from passing through all of its stages. In the House of Commons, MPs were historically very opposed to it. In 2015, there was a vote of 330 MPs against and 118 supportive. We know that since that time, 2 general elections have happened. There's been a huge churn in the number of MPs, and actually MPs are coming on side. They're changing their mind and being persuaded both by constituent stories and the developments around the world. Unfortunately, there isn't a bill active in this session of Parliament. As people might know, there is a ballot system for private members' bills in the House of Lords and House of Commons, and assisted dying was not picked out of the hat, as it were, for the ballot system in those chambers. So we are progressing the debate, but there isn't a bill currently under consideration in Parliament. In Scotland, however, there is a bill that's been proposed. They failed previously, but in the Scottish parliamentary elections last year, a very pro-choice parliament was returned, and there are indications that they would suggest that there are more MSPs supportive of assisted dying than there are MSPs who are opposed. The proposals were consulted on at the end of last year, and there was an unprecedented response to that consultation. The responses are being analysed and a report being drafted, and there will be a draft bill before the Scottish Parliament later this year. That will then be scrutinised by a committee in Scotland early next year, and a vote potentially by the end of next year. In the Crown dependencies, so Guernsey, Jersey, and the Isle of Man, all 3 have the potential to legislate on their own terms for assisted dying. Guernsey debated it back in 2018, but those proposals were rejected. However, in Jersey last year, the states of Jersey approved in principle assisted dying laws, and they have set out a process for debating and voting on this legislation following their general election, which I believe is actually tomorrow. And we expect there could be a vote on that legislation in Jersey next year. Similarly, in the Isle of Man, there was a vote just in May, and there was the proposals to bring forward legislation in the Isle of Man were approved. And again, the bill will be consulted on and drafted later this year with a vote potentially next year. I'd also add, I haven't mentioned Northern Ireland here simply because there isn't anything underway at present. That doesn't mean that we don't work in Northern Ireland, it's just there isn't currently anything on the table. So what happens next for Dignity in Dying's campaign is that in 2023, there could be 3 jurisdictions of the UK likely to vote on assisted dying, and all 3 of them potentially could vote in favour of assisted dying. So in Scotland, Jersey, and the Isle of Man, we may be looking at law change within the next couple of years. Here in Westminster, the House of Commons is going to be debating assisted dying on the 4th of July. So in just under 2 weeks' time, following a UK government petition that Dignity in Dying set up, and that's gathered over 150,000 signatures. There is the possibility that we could be looking at a review of the law through either government or parliamentary committee. There's nothing currently confirmed on that, but we'd like to think that there could be movement on this before the next general election, and we'll be pushing for that as Dignity in Dying in the next couple of years. And as I said, all 3 of those jurisdictions, Scotland, Jersey, and the Isle of Man, will be drawing up detailed proposals in the coming months. So we'll know more about that later this year. And then finally, it's just some ideas of how NPC members might like to get involved with the organisation or with the campaign. The petition that I mentioned earlier, which has over 150,000 signatures, will be closing next week. So please sign up to that if you haven't already. There'll be a link on the next slide. If you are supportive of assisted dying and haven't written to your MP, I'd really urge you to do so, because we have a debate in a couple of weeks' time. It's always good that MPs know how many of their constituents already support this. I think, as Jackie has suggested, it's often a very small but vocal minority of people who make their voices heard, and the majority of people who do support assisted dying actually don't make their voices heard as much as they could do, and we'd really welcome as much support as possible on that. If you're based in Scotland or Jersey or the Isle of Man, please keep an eye on the developments there and contribute to that process as they go along. And just as a kind of a challenge or an invitation for any NPC members to consider whether assisted dying should be adopted as a policy, whether to support the full legalization of assisted dying or to simply support the need for a review of the law, which I think is absolutely urgent at the moment, based, as Jackie said, on the damage that's being caused to dying people here in this country at the moment, and also the growing changes internationally, demonstrating that there is a safe, compassionate way to have assisted dying in countries very similar to our own. And then here are just some links and ideas of how else you might want to get in touch. As I said, the petition, if you want to sign up, go to www.dignityindying.org.uk/petition, and you'll be directed to the UK government petition page there.
Right, thank you, Jackie and Tom. It was very interesting. I have have a bit of a list of questions, actually. I'm just wondering how you define vulnerable people, because every organisation has a way of looking at what is a vulnerable person. And you're asking, in the bill, it asks for a person to have mental capacity. And I'm hoping that means that a member of the family could not make an application on behalf of somebody without mental capacity. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
I just kind of look for safeguards, because we know that there are an awful lot of older people who don't have a family member at all. They don't have anyone to look after them. They don't have anyone to speak for them. And it could be quite difficult. So it really needs to have strong safeguards around what we see as a vulnerable person, i.e. a person who doesn't have capacity, does have a family, and we have to say not all families are good families, but although those who do not have a family and who speaks for them. So that's one of the major issues, I think, for NPC members, is they may have particular wishes, but their family might have different wishes. So they want to be clear that their wishes override someone else's wishes. Is that right?
Do you want to take that first, Tom, and then I'll add something afterwards? Yeah.
Sure. So yes, Jan, the bills that Dignity in Dying supporters have always been very clear that mental capacity is absolutely necessary. We don't support any bills that would sidestep mental capacity, either by making advance requests or someone else making a decision for that person. We think it's for the person in the moment to be making that decision for themselves. The reason for that is because, firstly, we think it's an issue of choice for that person, and secondly, we think it's an important safeguard. We don't think it's right that people should be able to make the decision for someone else, and that's the law that's been working well in Oregon for 25 years. And it's the common feature of all the laws in Australia and New Zealand as well. The request would absolutely have to come from the person themselves. There'd be no opportunity for any other person, family member, neighbour, relative, and any other person than the person themselves making that request in the moment to that doctor.
Right. So really what we're saying is someone without capacity would not have that choice. Yeah.
Ultimately, yes.
That's the safeguard, is what you're saying, is they don't have that choice. Okay. That makes it really, yes, sorry, Jackie.
Yeah, if I could just come in and add to what Tom has said, the question of vulnerable people is so important, because this is the argument that is used all the time against an assisted dying law. I had somebody who came to me at work when the debate was going on in Parliament and said, why is this why is assisted dying a bad thing? And I said, well, actually it isn't. Why do you think it is? And she had had a letter from her church asking her to write to her MP saying, please don't vote for this law. I'm worried about vulnerable people. And the letter said, don't tell them that we've asked you to write this, and don't tell them that you're a religious person. So consequently, MPs were able to stand up and say, my letterbox is full of letters from people who are worried about vulnerable people. If you ask our opponents who they mean by vulnerable people, they don't really know, because they can't name people who would be vulnerable to the legislation, as Tom has said. You have to be of sound mind. You have to be pronounced to be terminally ill with only 6 months to live by a couple of doctors. And the proposal, as it has been recently, is for it to be reviewed by a judge. So there's no way that the family can come along and propose it for you because you're demented or you can't speak up for yourself. And in fact, our argument is that it protects people better than the current situation, where who knows what goes on. MPs who are against this will say, oh, your doctor will look after you at the end. They'll slip you a bit of extra morphine or something. No, they won't these days, not post-shipment. I know somebody who gave a patient a bit of extra morphine, ended up in the police station and didn't practice for 2 years. Doctors are very frightened of that. So it much better suits patients, and it much safer for doctors and healthcare professionals to have a law in place. And the disabled who are against this, if you ask them what they wouldn't be eligible for it. They wouldn't be eligible. The criteria are very strict. And in fact, the only complaint that's been made in Oregon that I understand from disabled people is what happens if we can't actually do this for ourselves. So they want the law to go a little bit further. So we and there's no record, just to finish this off, nothing in Oregon to suggest that any vulnerable people have suffered. And in fact, you probably know, Jan, that the families often want the patients to keep going much longer than the patients want to keep going. And sometimes people have to say to the family, actually, we're going to stop now because the patient's had enough. So I think that's been more the problem in the past.
Yeah, I think it is more of a problem, but, have to ask the question.
Sure. No, it's fair.
I'm not sure whether what you said about disabled people has actually answered this person's questions from Aisha, who we know is down in Norfolk. And she says, my concern is the misuse of such legislation to get rid of people with disabilities who may be aged and or not have mental capacity as a matter of expedience. Now, I think the answer you just gave around disability and the answer you gave around people with no capacity not having access to assisted dying process, do you think that covers that question, either of you?
I do. I'm sure Tom will have something to say.
Yeah, if I just add to that as well, I think, I can understand the fear of that, but I think the reassurance I would give to anyone who has those fears is that we now have plenty of evidence from across the world. As we've said before, Oregon for 25 years, California for over 5 years, huge jurisdictions now have had this in place, and we just don't see that happening in those places. And nor do we see sort of expansion to cover those sorts of cases that wouldn't be included in the legislation we're proposing at the moment. And you don't see any expansion of the laws, you just see a continually working, safeguarded model. And in fact, sort of touching on something that Jackie said earlier, if you look at the Oregon data, and there is data now going back for 25 years, the overwhelming majority of people who use the assisted dying law in Oregon they're older people, but they are people from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. They are people living with cancer. They are people who are generally quite well off, informed, and make decisions for themselves in all other areas of their life, and want to be able to make a decision about the end of their life, just as they have up until that point. So I think it's not about vulnerable people. It's about giving people that personal choice.
Yeah, the vulnerability is a category, as you say, around people with no capacity or very little capacity, and that would be picked up by the GPs on application, I would imagine, given that person might not have a member of a family. We know a lot of people without families, so yeah, I think that would be picked up. I have another question from David Vickers. Now, David is a retired nurse. Now, he's saying there is a difference between assisted dying and assisted death. And what he's saying is, as a qualified nurse of many years, I worked alongside people to help dignified dying over a variable period of time. Assisted death is another issue and refers to a premeditated act or omission which results in death, which he does not support. I mean, do you want to take that question? You're nodding, Tom. Do you want to take that question? And Jackie can add to it, yeah?
No, I'm nodding. Look, Tom's nodding because I'm not quite sure what's being asked here, so I'm going to leave it to Tom.
I think the reference, if I've interpreted this properly, is that in end of life care at the moment, there are hospices and palliative care professionals out there who do ease people's deaths within the law by, they give people dignified deaths. They allow them to be comfortable. They are given pain relief. They are sedated where necessary. And I think for the vast majority of people, that is the case. I think that it is the case that most dying people in this country do get excellent care at the end of life and do have dignified, pain-free deaths. But there is always going to be a small minority of people for whom that doesn't apply, whether it's because of, intolerance of pain medication or symptoms that are simply impossible to control. There is going to be a small minority of people who do suffer at the end of life. And it's, for us, I think we want to make sure that those people do have the option of taking control of their deaths if that's what they want. And I think also the distinction, I think, is well recognized within doctors, but I think generally members of the public don't often see a huge difference, a huge distinction between essentially allowing someone to be sedated to death and actually giving someone the choice to end their own lives. I think for a lot of people that's a distinction without a difference. I think as the end result is that the person dies, and our view is that it should be in the control of the person themselves, not the control of their healthcare team.
And the premeditated part of it is because that person chooses and has been through a form of referral, questions and answers, and as you say, that person must have a diagnosis that they are expected to die within 6 months. So yes. Is there a difference between euthanasia and assisted dying?
Yes, assisted dying is what we've been describing is the Oregon law that the patient must request it and must be able to administer it to themselves. Whereas euthanasia, the doctor, as Tom said earlier, the doctor can give you an injection or whatever. So that's only available in very few places. That's the Belgian, Luxembourg, Dutch law. And that's what they chose from the very beginning. So opponents of assisted dying will talk about what goes on in those countries, but really the law you pass is the law you get, as Oregon has shown. So if you pass that law as the Dutch did, for example, then that's where you'll go. And the fact that they've got that and Oregon has got a different law means it's not an argument for a slippery slope. They just started out in different places.
Yeah. I think that's very interesting in terms of looking at Oregon and the fact they've had it for so long. It's quite a progressive thing. In terms of what the NPC can do, we can circulate your petition and get people to sign it. In terms of us having a policy, I think that would be quite difficult because we have, as you've heard from David, we have people within NPC who would not sign your petition and would not agree that assisted dying was the way forward for them. So it'd be very difficult for us to have a policy, because that would mean that we would be enforcing the half of the NPC who are not accepting assisted dying, and they would have that forced on them, and that's not what the NPC does. So we couldn't have it as a policy. But we can certainly send out your petition and say to people, if it is your choice, to sign this petition, please do. And then, and I'm sure most of them that agree with what we're doing today will sign it, and that will probably bump up your numbers. So is there anything that either of you would like to add before we kind of give a closing down of the webinar? Yeah, anything that you think hasn't actually been covered? Yeah, Jackie.
I'd just make a couple of points about the arguments that are used against assisted dying. You will hear the opponents of assisted dying talk about assisted suicide. And we very deliberately don't call this suicide, which is a pejorative term and upsets the families of those who've died. And there was a young woman in California called Brittany Maynard, who got a brain tumor and was told she was going to die. And she became very active on social media. In fact, she was one of the people who really helped the legislation through. And she summed it up by saying, you know, I don't want to die, but I'm dying. And I want to control the manner of my death. So I think it's wrong to talk about suicide as opponents do. It's demeaning to the people who want to do it. And so we tend not to use, I know the British Medical Journal, for instance, doesn't talk about suicide anymore. They talk about people taking their own lives. So that's why we've chosen this term. The other argument that's used a lot of the times is about prognosis for people who are terminally ill. You know, how do we know that people are going to live only for 6 months? They might live for 8 months. They might live for longer. And the answer to that is it actually doesn't matter. Because these people aren't suicidal, they want to live as long as they can. And if they take the medication, which you know, in the UK, I understand, would be delivered on the day that they wanted it. But in fact, in Oregon, it's given to them as soon as they sign off, and they just put it in the fridge until they need it. And most of them, the majority of them, don't take that. They will not do that until their life becomes intolerable. So the business of prognosis, so we can't tell whether you're going to live for 6 months or 9 months, doesn't matter. What really matters is that during that period, when somebody has been given a terminal diagnosis and they're not sure whether it's going to be 6 months, they have that consolation and that comfort to know that if it gets bad enough, and as Tom said, it's a minority of people who can't be reached by palliative care. So we could make palliative care as good as you like in this country. There will still be a minority of people who have that bad end. They know that if it comes to that, they can go down that route. And that the whole population knows that, not only the terminally ill people, but their families and anybody facing that situation. So it's a huge comfort to everybody involved. And that's why I believe no assisted dying law has been repealed, because of the compassionate attitude it has to everybody.
Yeah. This is obviously going to be a long route, isn't it?
Let's hope not.
So you've been on the go for a while. Tom, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that's a good place for me to make my contribution. Is that it's been a long time going. I mean, Dignity in Dying as an organisation is nearly 100 years old. Its predecessor was set up in the 1930s. Dignity in Dying has been campaigning solidly on this as Dignity in Dying for this terminal illness law for 17 years now. And it has been a hard struggle, but we are seeing progress each and every year. We're seeing progress in the House of Lords. We are seeing progress amongst MPs. I do think there's reasons to be optimistic and hopeful about this. And we've seen around the world just these huge developments. I mean, in the, whatever it is, 7 years since MPs last discussed this, California, Canada, all of Australia, all of New Zealand, Spain, all these countries have started to take these views. So, and that's just in 7 years' time. I'd like to think it won't be another 7 years before we get to that point here in England and Wales. And I certainly don't think it will be in Scotland. I do think it's happening, and it's coming down the track quite soon. And I think what's really important to remember is that the longer it takes for this to happen, the more suffering we are putting people through at the end of life. It's forcing one person from Britain to go to Switzerland, for instance, to death every week. It's forcing potentially 17 people a day to die in pain, even in hospice care. It's forcing potentially a suicide every day amongst a terminally ill person. I mean, it's right that we are optimistic about law change, because we do have to be cognizant of the damage that the blanket ban is causing at the moment.
Yes, thank you, Tom. I mean, I think it's been a really interesting discussion, and there will be people with their own opinions, as we have heard anyway. And they're free to have those opinions. And I think it's really important for people to have had, the presentations that you've given. So I'd like to thank you very much for giving your time to us this morning. And hopefully it's clarified some points for people who've been watching this webinar and maybe have had some critical misunderstandings about what is going on, but also some critical understanding. So we have to accept both sides of the opinions, but I'm sure as things go on, things will change as you get closer and closer. But I certainly will circulate your petition, and we can get some more signatures for you. I'm sure there will be. But in terms of policy, I think probably not quite yet. As I said, the discussion we had just to get this briefing done was quite, you could say, fiery and heated. But we've done it, and thanks to you, it's been done extremely well and extremely considerate of people's different opinions. Okay, so I'm going to close the webinar now, and I hope to see you, Jackie, at a point in the future when we do our Hopeful Live annual convention. And thank you, Tom, for coming along. So I hope everybody has, can't say enjoyed it, but understood what we've been trying to do and make it as open and transparent as possible. So we'll close the